Welcome to Michael's. My name is Peter Michael, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Mark Gaylor. Judging by the number of people here, I don't have to say too much about Mark because the numbers will say themselves. The numbers speak for themselves, how the words go. But I will mention a couple of words. Mark is the Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom Ambassador for Australia. He's recently published his 30th book, only 30th, that's a lot of books, with Focal Press. He has also been a senior lecturer and program director at RMIT, and just recently is appointed a Sony Worldwide Ambassador. So that's enough said about Mark. I think we should hear from Mark, so welcome Mark Gaylor.
Thank you.
Just before he starts, I almost forgot the most important thing. He's sponsored by Sony. So thank you, Sony.
Well, thank you. I'm sure you're probably not here to see me. I'm sure you're here to hear about this particular camera that I'm holding, which is the Sony A9 camera. It's just over 10 years since Sony entered the interchangeable lens camera market. And boy, have they been moving very quickly in those 10 years. This Sony A9 is the first time Sony have actually compared themselves with what is perceived to be the competitors in the market, Canon and Nikon. This is the first time when Sony released a camera, they compared its performance with Canon and Nikon cameras. And this has caused a little bit of controversy. There's a lot of stories, both negative and positive, on social media, and it is because of that direct comparison. Basically, Sony are saying we've arrived. Not only have we arrived, but we've arrived with a mirrorless camera. Okay, so welcome to the Sony A9. I've been using this camera now for just over 6 weeks, and I'm going to talk to you about where it's been pitched at, which is sports, action, wildlife photographers, but also as a general purpose camera. Would you use it for general purpose photography? So, but first let's get into, a lot of people said that, just drop the hype, okay, because a lot of journalists have said a lot of nice things about it. And this has caused a little bit of anger in social media. So hype is a negative word. Hype would tend to mean that this camera doesn't deserve what people are saying about this particular camera. So I've just cherry-picked some of the points there. Like the two competitor cameras are Nikon and Sony sports cameras. Yes, they're very expensive cameras. They're there to shoot at very high frame rates with very large buffers and to track moving subjects with a great deal of accuracy. So let's look at the specs that this camera is competing with. Does it have a higher resolution than, say, the Nikon D5 and Canon 1DX Mark II? Well, we're comparing, this is a 24 megapixel camera and the competitors are only up to 20 megapixels. So there's no hype really there. It's a higher resolution camera for sports. Does it have a faster frame rate? We're looking at 12 and 14 frames per second from the competition, and this is 20 frames per second. So again, not really any hype there. Does it have more auto focus points? The ability to track something across the frame, because we can't always be keeping it in the center of the frame because it's moving erratically or very quickly. The more focus points, the better. And we're comparing 61 for the Canon, 153 for the Nikon, and 693 for the Sony. That's not a little bit more. Basically, those sensor points cover pretty much the all of that damn sensor there, a full frame sensor. Does it have a bigger buffer? Okay, so we're comparing with 93 RAW, 200 RAW, and this one has 241 RAW before the camera is likely to slow down. Okay, so it is the only sports camera that offers zero blackout. Typically with all cameras, whether they're mirrorless or use DSLRs, there always is going to be a little bit of a blackout when you're using a mechanical shutter or a mirror. That means that you're only looking at the subject that's moving for half of the time. Now, you can get quite good at following this, but this camera can use a fully electronic shutter whilst tracking, and so it looks like you're actually recording a video because there is zero blackout. There is no mirror and there's no mechanical shutter to get in the way of recording those shots. In default mode, this camera will make a noise when it's shooting, but it's an artificial noise. You can actually switch it off and go in stealth or fully silent mode. Okay, and the only indication then that it's shooting, which you can switch on, is just a little line that just blinks at you, just saying, I am now shooting at 20 frames per second. Okay, so we've talked about the silent mode, and although it's an expensive camera, I won't say this is a cheap entry-level mirrorless camera, it is significantly cheaper than the Nikon and Canon, more than $1,500 cheaper than those Nikon and Canon sports cameras. So I don't think it's hype, just to state the figures, and which is what I've been doing. Okay, so let's look at 20 frames per second. This is shot at a taekwondo evening. I had the camera for 72 hours before I went travelling, had to return it, and then I got another pre-release camera to take on my travels. So if I just show you that, okay, it all happens very quickly. Some people say, do you really need 20 frames per second? Well, let's take a look and let's wind that back frame by frame. Okay, and you're looking for a decisive moment. And in sports, a decisive moment can be where the ball just strikes the bat. And look, 20 frames per second is not, some people would like even more, because some people are still able to shoot an image where the ball is not in the shot, okay, because a ball off, say, a baseball bat will come and go very, very quickly. And so I can just basically roll, using Lightroom, roll backwards and forwards, looking for a moment that is my decisive moment. I posted these images to Flickr, and somebody said, why didn't you actually get them kicking each other? And I'm going, well, that's an odd thing, because the woman would break the other woman's ribs. Okay, that's a good reason that these people practice and narrowly miss, which is good for the taekwondo people, I'm sure. Okay, so this is, I went down to St Kilda Beach. St Kilda Beach, when the tide is out, is a beautiful place to capture running dogs. The shallow waters seem to go on forever, and the dogs absolutely love it. So that's 20 frames a second. And again, that's played back a little bit slower, but again in Lightroom, I would be going, where is the decisive moment? Typically, it's not when the dog is down for me. It's usually when the dog is on the up stride. Okay, so you can pick your, you see that's the 20th of a second difference. And when the subject goes towards the edge of the frame, that's really where you want your focus points extending out, because you've started tracking the head and now the head is on the edge of the frame. Okay, and a lot of the older DSLRs, all of those focus points are grouped around the center. Okay, so let's just moving forward, let's just show that again. Okay, decisive moment there. I'll just bring that back to the beginning and look at those shots. There you go. So, if you're shooting at 10 frames a second, that might be the shot you get. But I'm just looking for the one where the ears are fully levitated. Because for me, that is the hero shots. We're not talking about Cartier-Bresson decisive moments where you've got maybe a whole second. You're looking for a fraction of a second for that decisive moment. Okay, so let's just moving on. This one, I didn't even know what I'd got until I got it back to Lightroom. The guy was on a board, and now he's walking on water. And so you can see the expression, he knows he's lost his board. So and even the handouts, so you can, just the drama of those shots, you can be surprised, because it all happens so quickly. We don't actually know what we got until we get it back to the computer. Okay, so just to give you an idea, because I can't show you what it is, I've just grabbed a very short movie offline to show you what it's like recording with a completely electronic shutter with zero blackout. These little green squares, they are the focus points. And once you half press and lock on, they will track. It doesn't matter where the subject moves in the entire frame, viewfinder, it will track that. So just to show you that line that is blinking, I'll just replay that again so you can see that one more time. The edge line that's blinking is just showing you that it's recording at 20 frames per second. It's quite a surreal experience, you know, to just point the camera and have no sound and no blackout when you're recording these high action things. Those are the sensor points. Okay, so if you're not experienced at trying to track something, so long as you can keep a bit of the subject in the viewfinder, you're pretty much guaranteed that the camera will do the rest. One sports photographer just this morning online on social media said it felt like he was cheating with this camera because it was so easy to get all of the images sharp. There's a conspiracy theory online, would you believe, that the 160 photojournalists who were at the New York release were all paid to say nice things about the camera. As I said, some people don't want this camera to be as good as it is. So we've got a distortion-free electronic shutter. There has been electronic shutters for a very long time. Okay, but what happens is electronic shutters, the scan rate from the top to the bottom of the sensor is too long to record straight lines like the lines off this kite surfer. They would distort. A golf club that was swinging very quick would bow because of the scan time from the top to the bottom of the sensor. So in order to create a sports camera that had distortion-free electronic shutter, basically, Sony had to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Okay, they had to minimize the scan time from top to bottom. It's a bit like using a flatbed scanner. You're recording everything sharp, but if you were to drag the piece of paper as the flatbed scanner is working, everything would be distorted because of the time it takes to scan across. So the scan time is greatly reduced and has enabled now, for the very first time, to use electronic shutters for sports photography. Okay, so again you can see that, and we can, some people say, but you know, you've got loads of images, surely that's too many to cycle through. But when you're in Lightroom, it's just like playing a movie back. You cycle to the bit, just playing the fast forward key until you get to the decisive moment, slow down, roll backwards, forwards, and choose your moment. Okay, so let's take a look at, okay, the nice thing about these cameras, I've always enjoyed the electronic viewfinders rather than the optical viewfinders. One of the only negative points, because the resolution is very, very high on these now, the refresh rate is very fast, but on the A9 camera, they managed to double the brightness of the viewfinder. So even if you're on a beach in full sun, when you put the camera to your eye, it looks very, very bright. It doesn't look a little bit darker. Typically with these electronic viewfinders, as soon as you get them in low light, they're extremely bright and they're always advantageous. The real advantage of electronic viewfinders, of course, is what you see is what you get. So if you're underexposing, it looks dark. If you're overexposing, it looks too bright. You see your depth of field, so you know exactly how to adjust your settings to get the image you want. So I've always enjoyed that about electronic viewfinders. The high ISO, because this is a full frame camera, what we're always going to get with these full frame mirrorless cameras, or any full frame for that matter, is you're going to get really good dynamic range and really good high ISO performance. And so when I started shooting, these are Vizsla hunting dogs. I rang the guy who I'd met down in St Kilda Beach and got him to bring his dogs down. It was going to be low tide, it was going to be sun, and we arranged to meet on the beach. I started tracking these dogs even before the sun had risen, and the camera was locking on in very low ambient light because it's got what's called a -3 EV capability, so it can lock on in very, very low light and then track really reliably. But as we started recording very early in the morning, just as the sun was hitting the horizon, the camera was working at high ISOs. And the reason it's working at such a high ISO is because the shutter speed is shooting at 2,000th of a second in low ambient light. So your high ISO performance has to be good. And for most purposes, people are not even going to be aware that the ISO is pushed, because on a 4K image, a little bit of noise reduction in Lightroom, maybe 20, 30, the images look absolutely clean. Okay, so there's some of the images that I captured. This is just, it's basically Albert Park, just down on the beach there, Port Melbourne. Fortunately, I was because I only had the camera for 72 hours, I was blessed with good weather, and good weather for kite surfing is lots of wind. I've got a friend who's a kite surfer and said it's going to be a good day for kite surfing, so I went down to St Kilda again in the afternoon, and they were all sitting on the beach. And I said, what's the problem? No one's in the water. I said, we're waiting for the wind. And then, of course, then I realised why they're all waiting for the wind, because they're all getting big air. So there's a lot of erratic motion here. And you see one of the great things about one of these cameras is as it's locking on, there's basically 5 settings in here. How sticky do you want me to be to the actual subject that I've locked onto? Would you like me to switch to a better subject, or would you like me to stay with the subject you've locked on? So as these two pass each other, a good camera will stay on the subject that you first locked onto. It won't pick another subject because it has better edge contrast, let's say. So that's really important for a sports camera. To carry on faithfully with the first subject. So it's like picking one football player on a pitch. You want it to track that football player, not any football player. Okay, so this was all with the new 100-400 lens that is being released very, very shortly. I believe they've arrived in the country. Okay, so that was a 72-hour look, and I couldn't fault the camera. The battery life of these has doubled, which means that if you look at a rating for the battery, they're going to be saying that the battery is capable of doing 700 shots. The way they do those battery ratings, though, is slightly an atypical way for shooting for a sports photographer. The way they measure that is you take one shot, you review it, you zoom in, you zoom out, you switch the camera on, you switch the camera back on, and you take another shot. But for sports photographers who are shooting continuously and not reviewing their images, their battery life is actually good for 3,000 plus images before you need to change the battery. So you're going to be shooting for quite a long time. You're most possibly likely to fill the cards, 128 gigabyte card, before the battery runs out on you. This is another one of the advantage features for this camera is we've got 2 card slot. Okay, so and you can program the card to run, the 2 cards to run in a variety of different ways. You can have movies going to one card, stills going to the other, which is my preferred. You could have it duplicating the image to 2 cards. Okay, that will slow the camera down slightly, which is why I prefer movies going to the top card. And this is the bottom slot is the ultra fast slot. Sony developed ultra fast cards for this camera. Okay, so the read-write speed on this particular card is 300 megabits per second. A lot of people running the A7R2, A7 II, the fastest cards those typically use is a 95 megabit read-write speed. So this is typically 3 times faster at reading and writing information than, say, the A7R2. The battery, it doesn't look that much bigger, but it's worth double the life. The actual body is a little bit heavier, a little bit bigger than the A7 series cameras, but after you've held it in your hand for a couple of minutes, you actually don't really notice the difference. For people with really big hands, you can actually get a little bit of a grip extension. If you don't want to put the vertical grip with the 2 batteries on, you can just get an extra grip on the bottom, which just is somewhere to park your little finger if you've got a big hand. Okay, so another notable features with advancements with this camera is all manual controls for adjusting the focus settings and the drive modes. So for instance, you can go between AFS and AFC, continuous autofocus, without going into function menus or hitting custom buttons. Same thing with the drive speed. If you don't need 20 frames a second, you could quickly drop down to 10 frames a second if you want to adjust the camera, if you want to slow the camera down because it's working too quickly. Okay, so you've also got your timer and your bracket options up there as well. Okay, so size, you can see this is the direct competitor, one of the two direct competitors, which is the Nikon D5, and you can see even though this is slightly bigger than an A7, we're nowhere near the competitor's size there. Okay, so this has really been important. It's why I love the A7s when they first came out, because the airlines are getting harder and harder and tighter on those carry-on baggage restrictions. And so most airlines now have dropped down to the 7 kilo carry-on plus maybe a handbag or a laptop bag as well as that. So when I'm packing to go overseas, because I won't check any of my gear, I'm always trying to get down to 7 kilos of camera and lens. I might pack a tripod because I can replace that at the other end, but typically all of the lenses and cameras has to go into that 7 kilo, and that is exceptionally difficult with big DSLRs. Okay, so the first thing is we're not going to be shooting sports anymore. I'm just using travel photography now. This is a red squirrel. They're endangered in England. They're making a little bit of a comeback in the UK because they're culling the grey squirrels, which was an introduced species into the UK, which has taken over the red squirrel territory. They're exceptionally shy, okay? And I'm working with a 70-200 f4 lens, and I'm basically approaching these. I'm not in a hide with a 600mm. I'm like basically approaching these over a 20-minute period by shuffling ever closer. And I've got the shutter on silent because this guy is going to run up the tree if he detects absolutely any movement or any sound. Okay, so this is at 12,800 ISO with no post-production. I don't normally post straight out of camera, but that's as the camera sees it. These, you won't see it perhaps today, but these images I've posted up to my Flickr account, so you can download the full resolution image and zoom into yourself. Because a lot of people with the Sony systems, they'll say, how sharp is the lens? And I say, download the full resolution image, zoom in Photoshop, you tell me how sharp it is, because that's how sharp it is. Sharpness is often subjective, so just, so I often make available the full resolution images that people can download to either look at the noise or the sharpness. So I've got another example where I've added 40 noise reduction, which doesn't tend to steal away any of the sharpness. If you use too much noise reduction in Lightroom, you tend to get a little bit of a blurrier shot, but up to about 40 is quite passable. And these tones now will be completely smooth. And so that would easily go double page spread in a magazine and no one would know it's not a 100 ISO image. Okay, so I'm going to use this camera now for a variety of reasons. Typically I'd be using an A7R II, which I often described as a camera for all reasons really, because it does everything well. The only thing that I would never describe the A7R II is a sports camera. I have tracked very fast moving stuff accurately with the A7R II, but because it's got a frame rate of 5 frames per second and a quite small buffer, you wouldn't describe it as a sports camera, even though it can track fast moving stuff. Okay, so, but instead of, I've left the A7R II at home and I'm using the A9 to see how I feel about using this as perhaps my only camera. So first thing, let's take a look, portraiture. So I managed to grab one of the new 85 1.8 lenses. It's not branded as a GM, it's not branded as a G, it's not branded as a Zeiss. That means it's very affordable. okay, because it hasn't got those special names attached on the other end, but it is exceptionally sharp. Okay, it's one of the sharpest lenses in my kit bag, so it's a real bargain in the Sony range. Now, when I put it on the Sony, one of the beautiful things about the latest Sonys is their IAF, not just face detect, but eye detect in the face, works in continuous autofocus. So even if your subject is moving, it tracks the eye. Now, the A9 has got even better than the A7R2, and I didn't think that was going to be possible, but people can turn sideways on, and so it doesn't look to me like a face anymore. The camera shouldn't pick it as a face because it's profile onto the camera. The A9 carries on tracking the eye in profile view and in very, very low light. And so, although this has been designed as a sports camera, I actually found that it's an absolute perfect portrait camera, which would then open it up to wedding photographers as well, tracking the bride in very low ambient light, and at the reception it would always track the bride's face, because remember, you can register specific faces, not just any face with these cameras. So if you just take one picture of the bride before your wedding shoot and have that registered as the primary face, it will always find the bride in the shot and always make sure her eye is sharp, even when using f1.4 portrait lenses. Okay, so I shot a whole series of portraits on a stopover in Singapore, in Little India, and just tracked these people. Okay, a lot of people get nervous about photographing complete strangers. Normally I'll have a little bit of a conversation with somebody just to make that relationship between me and them a lot easier. This woman doesn't have a word of English, so it's all body language. I smile, she smiles, I take a photograph, she hasn't run away, so I move closer. So there, it's a bit like photographing squirrels, really. Don't get too close too quickly, otherwise you frighten them away. So just remember, that's where I start. Hello. And I wave and I drop the camera. I only take one shot, drop the camera, smile, make some hand gestures. She makes some hand gestures. I get closer and closer. And that's the shot I wanted. I mean, I love the really close shot. I'll often get so close that I just crop the top of the head as well. I really like presence in a photograph. And I'll be shooting this wide open, 1.8. So you don't want the tip of the nose sharp because the eye will be soft, okay? So the ears will be out of focus, the tip of the nose will be slightly soft, but the eyes will be bang on. Okay, so that's 1.8 IAF on an A9. Okay, chickens, very erratic. Unfortunately, IAF doesn't work on a chicken because it doesn't recognize it as a human face because it's not. So generally what I'm doing is I'm locking on with a point AF, not a wide AF, but what's called a spot, a variable spot AF locking on, and hopefully it'll track the eye and not go for anything else that is moving. It's harder work, I have to say, working at very wide apertures. This will be f4 on a 70-200 lens. This was my favorite one because this he's eyeballing me, but I know his head is pointing in a completely different direction, which gives it that sort of menacing chook look. Yeah, I'm sure he's eyeballing somebody else on the other side. He's got like stereoscopic stuff. So more erratic stuff. The amazing thing with this camera is you point, you lock on. You've got presets 1, 2 and 3 on the top of the camera. So anything that requires locking on and tracking anything that's moving, I'll usually program to the 1, 2 or 3. And so it's literally turn the camera on, point, and the camera takes over. That's why that photographer said it feels like cheating. As soon as you switch the camera on and you point and lock on, they're all sharp. So stealth mode, I don't have a 600 lens with me. So basically what I'm doing is if somebody says, oh look, there's a squirrel, they've lost me for 20 minutes because I'm shuffling. Every time the squirrel looks at the food, I advance half a pace. And so that's how I get so close with this stuff. And this is the culprit for ruining the red squirrel population. So this is just in a cousin's back garden. Okay, so we went up to the Dales, which is apparently the red squirrels have made a comeback in Scotland and in the far north of England. So we're up in the Yorkshire Dales, which is a beautiful part of the country. Some of the daytime temperatures were colder than it is here now, so even that it's their summer. So there is a payback for the rugged beauty. And here is that red squirrel, and I captured basically hundreds of these. Okay, they've got basically 4 hands, so they can hang upside down while they feed. There he is, dropping a piece of food. I've even though I'm not making a noise, any sort of minor movement with the camera at my face, he's looking up, and when he's looking at me, I'm not moving at all, and then he thinks there's nothing out there, and then back to feeding. This one, he knows I'm there, but I'm not moving, so he's trying to work out whether I present a threat to him or not. There again, is there anyone out there? Okay, and that's the one at 12,800 which I've processed. So they look indistinguishable from the ones that are shot at 3,200. Okay, so I actually have never photographed these. They look very menacing, and this is a female, so God knows what the males look like with their horns. But as I'm getting, because I love getting really, really close, so my wife's over a dry stone wall going, "Are you sure they're friendly?" And I'm going, "I don't know." I'm not even sure whether it's a cow or a bull. But and he's looking at me and I'm looking at him, and there we go. So another one of my favourite genres, so we looked at sort of wildlife, landscape, street. Love street photography. So this is where the camera has to lock on in a fraction of a second. This is catching people unawares. A lot of street photography is done with a 35mm lens at f8 and B there. I typically lean now more towards 85 with a 1.8 lens. And with a camera that can lock on and track focus very quickly, that does give a high success rate. So this is all my 85mm. Tilt screen. One person on one of my reviews said it's not really a professional camera because the screen tilts. Go figure. So a lot of that stuff is, rather than pointing the camera at somebody, because you may go notice, I'm very quick by the way, even if I do put the camera to my face, it's just that. And knowing that the camera locked on and shot even at 1.8 is very, very important. But often I will just pretend to be fiddling with the camera, you know, and then just tap. Okay, so people don't even know in silent mode, even if I'm standing next to them, that I've captured them, like so. You can see that's from the hip. Surely you can see the slightly low angle of view. So you can see that I'm just shooting from almost underneath her. And this is a guy just walking through a lane. That's simply, I see somebody walking, I lock on 20 frame burst, and they're all sharp. One of the interesting things, because with face detector no pre-program faces, it'll often take a hero face, because hero face, that's front on, so it will generally go to her. But if there's 2 people looking, this camera's got a joystick, and you can very quickly move the focus point from her over to the edge or down here if you decided you were looking for somebody else to be sharp at wide aperture. Okay, so this is really easy street photography. Just point down. No one looks up. If you're a little bit nervous about streets, just try and get a slightly higher vantage point. You can stay there all day and never be noticed. Okay, this is all that sort of split-second street stuff again, but with a slightly longer focal length. And typically, I used to do all street with a 35mm. We're using the 85 1.8. You can see the very, very shallow depth of field. The bokeh's fine. I mean, there are two Sony lenses with better bokeh than the 85. The 1.4 has a completely circular aperture, even stop down, and has very, very smooth and good bokeh balls. Perhaps the best one is the new STF lens, which is the 100 STF. It's got liquid, silken smooth, defocused areas. If you go to my Flickr page, you'll see that there's an album of images shot with that lens, so you can see how smooth the bokeh is. Okay, so I've basically positioned myself where I know people will put the incense sticks. So, and I've basically framed the background first. So when somebody emerges from the doorway where they've got the incense from burning, I can take a picture within a split second. So that ability to lock on and capture very, very quickly is pretty much the A9's forte. They only have to appear for a split second, and I have them. Okay, so let's do a little editorial piece up in the Dales on the sheep farming up there. And so we're moving into landscape. Okay, I love the dry stone walls must have taken centuries and centuries to establish in these very remote regions. No trees, notice. We're too high in too cold a climate. And again, even that much of a face, on the top left there is enough for the camera to track. It's a very off-center composition, but obviously it won't go for the sheep's face. It will always prioritize the human face. And if there's any element of an eye there, it'll lock onto that as well. Beautiful dry stone walls up in the Dales. And taking care of the fleeces. Another friendly character I met. Okay, another one of my favourite genres is the urban landscapes. This one, a lot of people describe this when I posted this online as almost like an Escher drawing. There's so many vertical planes and horizontal planes at different levels. It's actually a little bit of a visual puzzle to try and work out what is going on. There's various overpasses at different levels here. And all this is done in very low ambient light, handheld, 5-axis in-body image stabilization. So even though I'm working with quite a long zoom lens, I can slow that down below speeds you would normally expect. Okay, if you're coming from Canon and Nikon, you have stabilized lenses, but that's not nearly as good as having a sensor stabilized. And Olympus and Sony cameras now have this 5-axis image stabilization where you can pull exceptionally low shutter speeds on very long telephoto lenses. One of the best shots I've got to showcase that is I've got 1/10 of a second handheld on a 400mm lens. It's insane. Some people, an Olympus owner told me that they got a 1-second exposure handheld. Yeah, wow. So this low light telephoto in low ambient light with handheld, not using any tripods, really does pay off on these. Okay, this is pre-dawn. A couple of people doing selfies there at the hotel. Okay, so where the Sony sensors have always shined, and the most dynamic range of any sensors out there are found in the Nikon 800, 810 and the Sony A7R2. These are right at the top of the sensor pack for biggest dynamic range. The biggest range of latitude in high contrast situations, from deep, deep shadows to very bright highlights. And the A9 is absolutely no different. It has that huge dynamic range. So typically, because I was new to the camera, I did bracket 3 shots, two stops either side, just in case. But all of these shots that I ended up processing were all from one frame, okay? Because the dynamic range never meant that I actually had to bracket it all to capture the skies. So this is in the Lake District, Wasswater. Okay, so dynamic range was really important. Obviously, the forte for the A7R2, this is A7R2 territory with its high resolution, but even the A9, it can hold its head up in this area. Same with architecture, where you've got windows that have got light streaming through the windows, and you've got interiors which are exceptionally dark. Again, I was bracketing, but never used the bracket sequence. Could always pull information from the stained glass windows from the single exposure. This is Hereford Cathedral, which has the Mappa Mundi, one of the very earliest known maps in existence on pigskin, and also a copy of the Magna Carta. And they also have something called the Chains Library there. And some of these books date back to the 8th century, hand drawn by monks. And for some strange reason, they were having a curry night at the cathedral, and sponsored by BMW, all proceeds going to the restoration of the cathedral. To book a table was £10,000, $20,000 for a table. I think it was a way of being seen to be donating money, so everybody who was cashed up in the area was probably had a seat at one of those tables. Okay, back in Singapore with the architecture there. Okay, so typically this stuff would be, my favourite vantage point for a lot of this landscape and architectural stuff is very, very low down. I often travel with one of those Manfrotto Pixie tripods because there's no reason to apologise for not having your tripod with you, because they go in your back pocket or in a side pocket of your camera bag. But even then, you know, the camera is on the ground, but I haven't even mounted it on the tripod because the 5-axis image stabilization on a wide angle lens, I'll typically go as low as 1/5 of a second handheld, and so can pull the f/16 aperture even in low ambient light. So this is all by the Gardens by the Bay. If you're travelling through Singapore or breaking your journey on the way to Europe, it's a fabulous, all its construction is on reclaimed land. One of the hotels that I've wanted to stay at for a very long time is this very unusual hotel. It's called Park Royal on Pickering. It's there's more greenage than the surface area that the hotel actually takes up. It's basically they've invested in vertical gardens, so there's so much greenery hanging off the side of this hotel. It's also, there's not a straight line in many of the angles on this hotel, which makes it a beautiful place to stay if you're interested in architecture as well. How's that for a... That's their car park to the hotel. It's gorgeous, isn't it? Yeah. Being in a tropical climate helps, I think. So interiors again, just remember, you know, you've got full detail in the windows, and it doesn't matter how dark these leather couches go, you can pull up the texture of the fabric from a single frame. So a great hotel to break your journey if you're staying there. It's a little bit pricey, but definitely worth the money. Again, beautiful time of the day to be shooting this architecture is when the sun has already set. So you're getting a mixture of colour in the night sky. It's not gone completely black yet, but you're getting full detail in all of the dark tones of the hotel, which is fabulous. Okay, so that really sums up my travels with this camera. That was just really a snapshot of what I've been able to do. But this really is, just like the A7R2, it's a camera for all reasons, except this one has probably got a little bit of a specialised area, well, a lot of specialisation in that fast tracking subject sport. So if you're interested in a camera that can shoot motorsports, or horse racing and you'd want to do a lot of that sort of stuff, this is definitely the right investment if you're interested in that camera. Now I'm going to be available for questions downstairs. I'm going to hang around for the next hour, so if you want to ask more about this camera or appropriate lenses for your alpha system, I will be online. I'll also, I've been using that slide for a while now, so another nail in the coffin production. You can read into that what you will. Okay, so I also, if you go to my website, markgaylor.com, I treat it as a learning resource. I've got lots of movies, both for Photoshop, Lightroom, but also for Sony Alpha cameras. I've got downloadable tutorials, Adobe presets, and it's all free. I'm not selling anything to you guys, it's all free. Okay, if you're an Alpha owner already, I run, make sure you join the, there's a Sony Melbourne group on Facebook. There's also a Sony Australia Facebook group. I run both of them. I'm admin for both. And on the 29th of July, we meet in Port Melbourne and at Mr. Hobson, which is just by the Spirit of Tasmania. We meet once a month and you can meet some like-minded Sony Alpha people. And it's a bit of a show and tell event. Everybody brings their latest purchase and and shows everybody else what they've just bought. But it's a great place to also ask questions if you're not too sure of a particular camera settings. Everybody tends to go away happy. If the weather's good, quite a few people go off and start shooting around Port Melbourne because it's quite a scenic place for landscape and streets, etc. Okay, so that's me. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. I have to say, with all new cameras, knowing what these features actually do, in other words, how to use them and how to really, where they give you value. So there's lots of value in all these cameras and all the features, but understanding what they can do for you is so important. And I think watching Mark's presentation there, he does a wonderful job of turning the features into how you can make the most of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.